Welcome to Killer Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. Welcome back. Over the last few weeks, we have been focusing on a number of shows around thinking styles and thinking, and how do you think creatively, and how do you come up with new products or new service ideas. And for the last 2 weeks, we have been focusing on the out of the box thinking. When we did that as a two-part series, we got into a lot of detail. If you missed that show, hop on over to killerinnovations.com and you can check that out, or you can find it also the videos like we're doing right now over on my YouTube channel. Just search for Phil McKinney, and you'll find it. Today's topic is a little bit different. While we've been talking about out of the box thinking, one of the things that a lot of people overlook is what we call inside the box thinking. Now, inside the box thinking is something that I would have to honestly say very few, if any, teams or organizations or even thought leaders ever think about. Now, why is that? Now, there's this negative view of inside the box thinking. And if you went and talked to a bunch of people and you asked them what they thought about inside the box thinking and what does that really mean, the first definition that they would come up with is, it's kind of the traditional, the old way, the the old thinking styles. You're doing it the way you've always done it. And there's this, I don't know what you want to call it, a myth that you just will not come up with any kind of good ideas if your thinking styles around inside the box. Now, what do we mean by the box? The box can define a lot of things. In the previous show, we talked about the box being really coming out of this metaphor of the 9-box puzzle that consultants, big consultants in the 70s and 80s came up with, that said if you had 9 dots, and you get only in a few number of lines without crossing or each other, not lifting your pen, how many lines would it take for you to put a line through all 9 dots? And you can get down to one line. Yes, you can get down to one line and cover all 9 dots. Again, go back. We covered that in part 1 of the out of the box thinking. But in this case, in the inside the box, everybody's view is that if you inside the box is the negative. It's something you shouldn't do. You should get out of it. I'm here to tell you that is bogus. There actually is a purpose. There actually is a benefit, and you can actually innovate in major ways if you know how to deal with inside the box thinking. It is different. It is not something people think about. So by having this and putting this into your arsenal, you get the benefit of having a tool in your innovation toolbox that others will not or do not have. So what is it that I mean by inside the box thinking? Well, what I mean by inside the box thinking is to innovate within the constraints defined by the box. The edges of the box are not always a negative, right? It's what more generally described as constraint-based innovation. And if you've been a long-time listener to the show, you've heard me talk about constraint-based innovation. There's been entire shows on this, so you can, go back into the archive and take a look at it. But the whole idea behind inside the box thinking is understanding your constraints and then using those constraints to your advantage in the form of innovating around them, or innovating them to get rid of them, or innovating them to turn them on their head to give you some form of advantage. So again, what I mean by inside the box thinking is to innovate within the constraints defined by the box. Now, the box can be an entire organization. It could be an entire government. It could be a department. It could be down to a team. However you want to define the box, but it defines your here and now, where you're operating in. And that box can then include things like, a whole, wide, range of things, such as, inside constraints, constraints that you control with inside your organization, things that you can manipulate and change, if you need to. And then you've got outside the box. Those are things that are not underneath your organization or your team's control. Things that are more likely to be, you could argue they're almost inflicted on you. But what we're going to talk about is looking at these two areas of constraints, inside constraints and outside constraints, and think about them in the context of, are they really constraints or do they create advantages? And thinking about them a little bit differently. So let's jump right in on inside, types of inside constraints. So what do I mean by types of inside constraints? Well, there's all kinds of constraints. You can talk about them in the context of, strategy and vision. We're going into this market to serve this customer with this product. That is a constraint. Can you think about that constraint differently? Do you have policies and procedures and rules and things that you're clearly told you can do or you can't do? Depending on how those policies and procedures are put together, they can be pretty constraining. Decision making, or how the criteria of decisions are made. Does everything need to go to the CEO, or does everything need to go to an executive team? And then what's the criteria? Do they make it on emotion? Are they fact-based? How do they make decisions? And then resource allocation. How does your organization allocate resources? Resources to me are time, people, money, and equipment. Equipment can also be things like supply chain or manufacturing facilities. Any of those things. When I was the chief technology officer at Hewlett Packard, one of the biggest assets we have is the supply chain, the manufacturing process, and being able to take a new innovation and having the power, size, and scale of HP supply chain, the largest technology supply chain in the world at the time that I was there as an executive, hugely powerful, hugely powerful. But they can be a resource allocation, and how do you earn the right to take advantage of it? Now, how do you deal with these inside constraints? Well, one is that an organization or a team has to have, some set of characteristics around it. So if you're trying to innovate inside the box, these are the things that your organization either should or you should make sure you put in place to encourage innovations inside the box. If you don't have these pieces in place, innovating inside the box will be incredibly hard to do. So those include leadership. Do you have an innovation culture? How are the resources for innovation? Is there a process to get resources committed to innovation projects? Patience. Wow, big one. Innovation framework and processes. BHAGs, bold, hairy, audacious goals. Again, I've talked about this many, many times on this show, and we're going to talk about it again today. The importance of setting and identifying a BHAG to drive inside the box thinking, to drive innovations that are going to have those kinds of impacts. And then execution. So again, we talk about leadership, CEO leadership of your team. It could be tied to an organization or a culture from the standpoint of a team or organization, or entire governments. Culture being absolutely critical for success. The resources of innovation. Do you have access to resources? Can you bring those resources together? And patience. Does the organization have patience? The innovation framework. We've talked about this heavily within the context of Killer Innovations and the workshops we teach, including FIRE, which is the innovation framework we teach and we encourage organizations to take advantage of. And then the BHAG. Defining that BHAG is critically important. And then execution. These is the way of dealing with these inside constraints. You have to have these characteristics. Now, there's a lot more detail, and we're actually going to cover that in the next segment. So we're going to go into detail about what do we really mean by leadership and culture and resources and patience and those kinds of things. But if you've been in this show and listening to me or following my blog or watching videos of me in the past, you're going to recognize these 7 elements. What are they? It's what we refer to as the 7 laws of innovation. The 7 laws of innovation define the things that organizations and teams have to have in place in order to have and achieve innovation success. We started off ending the last segment talking about how do you deal with these inside constraints. And albeit, as I mentioned, this is something I've talked about on the show before. These tie out to what we call the 7 laws of innovation. These same activities actually do apply to out-of-the-box thinking for an organization to be supportive, but they are absolutely critically important for inside the thinking. So what is it that I mean by each of these? So let's hop right in. Leadership. Having your leaders within an organization, or you as a team leader, understanding and being supportive of innovation is absolutely critical. It doesn't matter whether it's you just as a team leader. Yes, you can bring leadership to your team. If you're trying to do organizational innovation, you need to have that support. But in order really to achieve innovation success, you need to have alignment from the board to the CEO, to your manager, your leader, to you as a leader within your organization. The question I always ask people to think about is how much time does your leadership spend thinking about innovation? How much time? Is it worth 1% of their time? 5% of their time? 10% of their time? With one important criteria, and that is getting a status update from an innovation leader does not count against that time. What I'm asking about is how much time do they actually spend? I am shocked by how many senior executives, CEOs, and even CTOs who don't know how to even demonstrate their own product. They could not pick up their product and step in for a salesperson and do a demonstration of the product, right? How are you going to innovate if you're not into your products and services at that level, if you are not that comfortable with it? So again, leadership. How much time do you spend? How much time does your leadership team spend on innovation? And again, getting status update does not count. Innovation culture. Now, culture is absolutely key, because that's going to support people coming forward and developing ideas and sharing ideas and taking risks, etc. But let me tell you, it is hard. If you are in an organization that does not have a culture that supports innovation, changing the culture, I'm going to warn you right now, is incredibly hard to do. But you have to change it. You got to be willing to tear it down to the studs and rebuild it if you really are committed to wanting to drive innovation. The other is as a leader, you want to recognize and encourage good behavior. If you see someone doing something the right way, you want to encourage that. You want to make a point of it. You want to highlight it. At the same time, if you see people doing bad behaviors, things negative to the innovation culture, things like, not invented here or passive aggressive, you want to put a stop to it. The one thing that I share with CEOs that I coach with, when they come to me and complain, and they're complaining about, some action occurring inside the organization, and I have to keep reminding them, as a leader, you get the organization you deserve by the worst actions you allow happen. If you allow people to have, bad habits, bad actions, negative cultures within your team, you deserve what you get if you're not willing to stop it, correct it, remove people out of your organization, change people, telling them exactly what you expect. You get what you deserve. Resources. You got to have resources. The key on the resources is they need to be devoted to innovation. They can't be resources that, go willy-nilly. You need people, money, time, and equipment. Time is the critical one. We expect people to do their full-time job and then innovate at night and on weekends. If you do that, you're going to get night and weekend quality innovations. You need to build time into it. And then do you put your best resources on it? Is your A team or is it the people on the bench? I see this in a lot of consulting practices where consultants who are not billed out are put on innovation projects. Well, if they're not billed out, that means the clients did not want them. The clients did not want them, then why do you want them on your innovation project? Put your A team. And are those resources protected? Is it just because someone's on the bench and then next week they're going to be, gone and off to something else? That's a problem. Patience. Innovation takes time, especially inside innovation. You have got to have the patience, and you got to get to the point of not tying resources to the budget cycle. Are you saying, okay, you're approved for 1 year, at the end of the next year, you got to, go through reapproval, and that means you kind of get this high energy on a project, and then it kind of tanks. Are people really committed to that project? In my case, I believe in a funding model that says if it's 2 years, you fund it for 2 years, and that team does not even need to go through budget approval. It's automatically guaranteed, baked into the budget going forward. Must have patience. You have to have an innovation framework process. This isn't something that, we're just going to brainstorm, stick 10 people in a room and come up with some ideas. Guess what? You do that, you're going to end up with either two types of ideas. Buck Roger ideas, things that are going to require a violation of laws of physics, or you're going to end up with these little bitty incremental innovations. An innovation framework, innovation process, that's what you need. You must have it. And it must be tailored to you. It must match your organization and match your culture. This is not a one-size-fits-all. And then a BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal. BHAGs really need to focus on defining a time. What is a big, huge objective you're going to go after? What's the time frame? What's that objective? And then what's the criteria for success? Best BHAG I've ever heard is John F. Kennedy. And the BHAG was, before the end of the decade, we will put a man on the moon and return him home safely. Set the time frame before the end of the decade. Success, the objective, put a man on the moon. Criteria for success was returning them home safely. And do it before the end of the decade. So that is the BHAG. Execution. This is a big one. But keep in mind, ideas without execution are a hobby. And I don't know about you, I'm not in the hobby business. I'm in the business of creating and delivering innovations. And in my entire career, right, has been about delivering those innovations. And having ideas in a notebook, great. Value, zero. So, we've covered this: leadership, the innovation culture, resources for innovation, patience, the innovation framework and process, the BHAG, and then execution. Let's continue our conversation on this. What are the types of outside constraints? We've talked about inside the box thinking is really about constraints. There are two types of constraints: inside constraints, which we talked about in the first two segments of the show, and now we're going to talk about outside constraints. And what do we mean by outside constraints? Well, here are just a few. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a few. And that includes competition, outside investment, partner suppliers, government regulations. I've worked in regulated industries, and so I have a little bit of perspective on that. So let's talk about each of one of these in detail. And again, what do we mean by outside constraints? What we mean by outside constraints is the fact that these are constraints that are typically outside of your control. Now, you can innovate around them, but these are constraints that get imposed upon you, or ones that you can leverage to your advantage. So constraints aren't always negative. They can also be something that you can leverage. So let's talk about the first one: competition. Well, competition, these are your competitors. What is it what are some of these constraints? Well, one is the, economies of scale. If your competitor is much, much larger than you, then their cost for, the raw commodities that go into to become part of their product or service or whatever it is, they get that at a lower cost per unit. their ability to invest, their ability to fund. There's advantage. If you're the big player and you've got a small competitor, you get the economies of scale. But there's also a way to innovate around the economies of scale, and that includes blowing up the economy of scale, right? It used to be if you thought you were going to be, you wanted to offer a new transportation service, be a new taxi company or whatever, it was cost prohibitive because you had to have all this capital to go buy cars, buy taxis, buy limos in order to get in it. And look what happened with Uber and Lyft. They did an in run around the economies of scale, and in many cases they turned that into a negative for the established players, whether it be Yellow Taxi or Hertz Rental Car or whatever. So economies of scale, not always a positive, but like any of these areas, you can innovate around of. Competition also includes product differentiation. Do they have features you don't have? Capital requirements. How much capital is required for your industry or for your business? And somebody else may have a good lock on that source of capital. Cost disadvantage independent of size. You can have a small competitor that keeps you locked out because of patents, trademarks, unique top trade secret knowledge that nobody else has access to. So there could be some cost advantage, right? And then there's access to distribution channels. Do they have a lockup? Do they have exclusive channels that are their own, such as their own retail stores, etc.? These are all constraints, outside constraints that you have to deal with. Next is outside investments, right? Innovation requires capital. There's just not an easy way around it. You can't, very hard, let's put it this way, to do real game-changing innovations at a cost of zero. Now, the cost has come way down from what it used to be, right? With everything from software's pretty cheap, low-cost cloud services, hardware devices, the ability to go to China and get prototypes built, all of that. Now, there's lots of different ways, to get capital. You can get it from individuals, corporate, shareholders, venture capitalists, banks, suppliers. Customers can be a source of funding, all kinds of different structures. You can innovate a variety of different ways to innovate investments, but it's a constraint because the risk associated with innovation, some firms in need of finance may not be able to obtain it. You may have a great idea, but you can't get the risk capital like venture capitalists to invest, right? Your ability to deal with this outside constraint becomes important. And this outside constraint can in some cases determine whether or not you live or die, whether or not your product will ever see the light of day, right? So innovating how you think about and how you source investment capital, don't go the normal route, innovate this even, okay? Partners and suppliers. Companies, if you can find a way to combine your innovation efforts with partners, suppliers, third parties, you can bring products to market faster, giving you really unique competitive advantage. Now, I've done probably, and I refer to this as co-innovation, and I've done probably 30 co-innovation projects over my career. The one they're very, very hard to structure. You want to find organizations and partners and suppliers and that have a very similar culture to you. They're committed to innovation. Then the next thing is you want to find common area of interest. What I kind of refer to as the Venn diagram. So take your Venn diagram, where's that overlap, right? And you want to find a project that's right in that overlap, highly interested in both parties. The key criteria that I always use, though, around co-innovation efforts is around mutual dependency. You want to create innovation projects where both parties are dependent on each other. One brings one skill set, one brings the other skill set, but you need both of them to succeed. Otherwise, if any one of the parties could just walk away and do it on their own, it's not really co-innovation. You're just using other people's dollars. And this isn't just about dollars. It's about getting access to expertise and supply chain and resources and et cetera. So you must have common culture, common area of interest, mutual dependency. Key. Now, there's downside considerations you should have for this effort. You need to think about the governance and, knowledge sharing and, avoiding opportunistic behavior, right? Where one party or the other gets some go-to-market advantage to the disadvantage of the other players, right? You truly want to make this as a win-win-win-win type of structure. And if there's any hint, taste, or smell around it being anything other than that, walk away. Walk away. It's just not worth it, and you'll waste a lot of time. And given how hard these things are, it can be a real challenge. Government regulations. Look, the government can define policies and regulations that can prevent you from entering industries, or requirements to be able to get in, or limit your access to raw materials. Yes, governments can restrict your access to raw materials. If you need something that has to be imported, and all of a sudden a trade war breaks out and you cannot import that resource, you now don't have access to a raw material critical to your product or service. You could also establish barriers to entry, right? They can say that you got to meet this requirement before you can even, be in this industry or to become a big player in this industry, right? Such as air and water pollution or safety regulations or any number of other things, right? So government regulations and policies can be a big barrier. Now, this is also one area that I've had some experience where it's what I would call false constraints. People telling you that something is covered under a certain regulation or you cannot do it because of a government regulation. What I would warn you to look out for is do not believe it. When I was one of the founders at Intelligent, it's a fixed wireless provider, 72 markets in the US, 12 countries overseas, and it was in the fixed wireless and what's called the DIMS band, the 14 gigahertz wireless spectrum band. And we were building, this is 1996, the very first online billing platform, real-time billing platform. Now remember, this is 1996, so this is back when all we had for a browser was the prototype browsers coming out of University of Illinois. And so, with Mosaic. So so in this case, we were building the very first website to do real-time, on-time billing, and it turned out to be, someone said it was not allowed, it was illegal, the regulations didn't allow it. I yelled, BS, go prove it to me. They couldn't prove it. We launched. Huge win. So again, types of outside constraints: competition, outside investments, partners and suppliers, and government regulations. All of these are constraints that you are going to have to deal with. Now, we had talked previously about out-of-the-box thinking, which was think differently, think with a different perspective, and that's all the things we covered in the previous two shows. So there's a out-of-the-box thinking part 1 and out-of-the-box thinking part 2. This week, as we're wrapping up here in segment 4 of inside-the-box thinking. And again, everybody tends to think that inside-the-box thinking is this, you never want to do it, it's old think, you'll never come up with anything, only good ideas come out of the-box thinking. And that is absolutely 100% bogus. So, if I want to take everything we've covered in today's show and I want to summarize it down for you to make it really digestible, what is it we really mean by out-of-the-box thinking? And that is, inside-the-box thinking is to constrain the problem, but not the potential waste of solving it. Constrain the problem, right? Now think back what we've covered already in the show. What are the different ways we've talked about constraining the problem? One is in the use of a BHAG, the bold, hairy, audacious goal, right? In that case, what did President Kennedy say? I want to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade and bring him home safely. He's constrained it. Time frame. Got to do it within the decade, right? We got to put a man all the way to the moon. Doesn't count part way. Got to put him on the moon. Success, though, is bringing them home safely. right? Now, what is it that President Kennedy did not do? What he didn't do is he didn't say, and we're going to do this by a 3-stage rocket, we're going to do a slingshot. No. He constrained the problem, but not the ways to solve it. One way to really encourage in-the-box thinking is to have very clear problem statements. And I've talked about this before. Go back, you can check out previous shows. Problem statements are absolutely critical, and they're hard to do. But if you can crisply define the problem, you will radically increase the quantity and the quality of the ideas, because human ingenuity clicks in. And when we're posed with a problem, what do we want to do? We want to solve the problem. If we do a really good job of thinking through the problem, we will solve the problem. Why is the problem statement so important? The old Albert Einstein quote. Einstein said, or Albert Einstein was given a problem. He said, if you were given 1 hour to save the world, what would be the first thing you would do? He thought about it, and he goes, if I had 1 hour to save the world, I would spend 55 minutes understanding and defining the problem. And then I'd spend 5 minutes solving it. We tend to not do that in the innovation space. We want to jump in and brainstorm solutions. Spend the time, think about it. Inside the box thinking is around constraining the problem, but not the potential ways of solving it. Inside the box thinking is also to constrain the atmosphere, but not the team. And this is really around culture, giving them permission to innovate inside the box, but also granting autonomy, right? You want to constrain the atmosphere. You want to make sure that there's not, bad things happening. There isn't bad culture running around. But you don't want to constrain the team. The atmosphere, the box. You got to deal with the reality of the box, right? But you don't want to constrain the team to be able to use innovative abilities to come up with an inside the box thinking. Use the constraints to your advantage. So again, that's culture, it's permission, and it is autonomy, which is absolutely really critically important for for the teams. And then you want to constrain the resources, but not the ways to utilize them. The resources: people, time, money, equipment. Those are your constraints. Now, I've shared this story many times. I'm going to share it once again. In my past, when I've had people come to me with ideas, and they'll tell me they need X number of people over X amount of time, and they need these access to this equipment or capabilities or whatever. Now, in some cases, leaders may give the team exactly what they want. In my experience, when a team has gotten 100% of what they want, their deliverables is absolutely zero. What I've gotten in the habit of doing is I'll squeeze the constraint. So they'll go, I need 10 people, $1 million in a year. And I go, well, I can maybe give you 6 people, and I can maybe squeeze in maybe $700,000. That's all I can get out of the budget, right? And we really need to have it 9 months, right? Everybody runs out of the room with their hair on fire going, oh my God, I can't do that. You know what happens? They throw the rule book out and they figure out a completely different way to do it in order to meet the constraint. So constraint-based innovation is hugely powerful, and constraining resources can empower a team to innovate inside the box in such a way that they can come up with something pretty interesting and pretty novel. Okay? So that wraps up our talking about, the inside the box. And really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today here on Killer Innovations. If you are interested in, hearing more about this, check out the Disruptive Ideation Workshop. This is either an 8 or a 12-hour workshop, depending on how the organization wants to take it all in. This is the workshop that we have actually been teaching to a variety of organizations, most recently the U.S. Marine Corps, helping them change their entire thinking styles and how they define problems and how they can develop ideas and rank those and drive those to execution. So we've had a huge amount of fun doing that. If you want to stay in contact with me, you can check it out. Here's all my contact information: email, blog, podcast, etc. If you want to keep updated, text the word innovation to 44222 or send an email to innovation@killerinnovations.com. And with that, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule. One thing I would ask, tell others about the show. Always looking to grow the listener base. We'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.